Jane, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dave. It's great to be here.
Awesome. It's a really cool moment for me because I was an aspiring nonfiction author and I saw your name on websites and like speaking engagements for years. So it's really great. Like you're a great reporter on the industry. So I really appreciate you being on the show.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. All right. So talk about how you got into publishing, Jane.
Uh, my entire career going back to college, so I've been nothing if consistent. uh, I I majored in creative writing. When I went to grad school, I worked at the Writing Center while I was holding down a publishing job. So it's really been a constant. There's really been no time when I wasn't working in some form in writing and publishing, whether that's newspapers, literary journals, or books.
Fantastic. So why reporting on the publishing industry? Why go that route?
I think it ultimately combines two interests or two talents. So in in my earliest days as a writer, the jobs that I enjoyed most were actually writing and reporting. Didn't really matter what the topic was, but like in college, I reported on student government. And then once I got into the traditional publishing industry, I was working on books, I was working on magazines, and I ended up becoming very much an expert in what was happening on the business side of the publishing industry, partly because of job requirements. I used to work for Writer's Digest, which is known for giving advice and education on writing and publishing to an audience of writers. So, I myself was just very curious about trends and how the business was changing. It was a very disruptive time during kind of the bulk of my traditional focus. This was in from roughly 2000 to 20, let's say 2014, where the internet, social media, ebooks, Amazon, all of this was changing how you made a living as a writer and who was competing as a writer and all the rest of it. So in any event, my expertise on the industry plus just my natural interest in reporting combined.
Fantastic. You're talking about change and the industry keeps on evolving.
Mm.
Disruption keeps happening. As AI, internet, all this sort of stuff is really, you know, beating up the industry a little bit. So
Yes.
how
Yes.
how are book publishers, traditional publishers staying alive?
Well, it's a little bit of a paradox here. So while there has been tremendous disruption and there have been a lot of jobs affected on both like inside the industry and outside for writers, the book publishing is actually doing really well in terms of sales. So some of the decimation you see in other entertainment industries in the transition to digital, that hasn't really come to pass as of yet for book publishing. There were a lot of predictions back around 2010 that ebooks would take over,
Right.
or that traditional publishing would die.
Right.
Um, that has not happened. So if you just average it out across all publishers, all types of works, fiction and nonfiction alike, print is still 75% of sales.
Really?
Now, yes. Now, if you look at very, very specific sectors, like let's say romance, you will in fact find ebooks make up the bulk of those sales. But again, if you look at the average, 75% print. So people have not let go of their print books.
Okay, so I'm a little bit confused, Jane, because I'm seeing all these publishers merging, like big publishers becoming one. Isn't that like a sign of, oh, well, there's trouble here. There's some troubles happening, no?
In my opinion, no, but there are certainly people who disagree with me on that.
Okay.
So just to give some background, at this point in time, there's what's known as the Big Five. So these are like the big conglomerates that primarily sit in New York, but they're actually four of the five are owned outside of the United States. They operate globally. They're owned by companies like News Corp or Bertelsmann, which may be familiar to some people for owning other things and doing other things. And they also happen to be involved in book publishing. So yes, it's very much true that I would say this is going back 40 to 50 years at this point, these conglomerates have been eating up all of the smaller publishers. That said, because it is no big deal at this point to publish a book. Like anyone can publish a book at the click of a button. I'm not saying it's a good book, but it really doesn't take much to publish a book these days. Because that so many barriers have fallen down, distribution barriers. You don't have to have inventory of a book to have it available for sale on Amazon in print form. It has led to all sorts of self-publishing activity, independent publishing activity, smaller publishers that if they're nimble and they understand, how to reach their readership, then they can be quite successful and even challenge some of these big houses in their niches.
Wow, I'm just still stuck on that 75% print number you gave us. So what is it like? I guess there's still a lot of older people out there reading books. They love the tactile feel. Like, what explains something like that in this digital age? How is that possible?
So there is this stereotype that it must be the older people who are holding on
Sure.
to the print, but that's not actually the case.
Okay.
Older people like Kindles and ebooks because they can make the size so much bigger, like the size of the font. And younger people are as happy, if not more happy, to have a print book because they too get exhausted with digital media, with social media, with the dings and the bing, and like all of the little alerts. And so there is a movement of younger people who very much want to have their reading space separate from their devices. But I don't mean to paint age groups with a
Sure.
too broad a brush. You're going to find different personalities and different preferences in every sector. But I don't think you can look at this as an age issue.
Okay.
It's about something else.
Got it. Well, for the record, everybody, I prefer physical books. It gives my eyes a rest from the blue screens and all that sort of thing. So I prefer those. All right. So Jane, let's talk about nonfiction authors and how they could possibly make a living today. Like I was an aspiring nonfiction author. I've written some books, some sports books and stuff like that. And I've seen a little bit of how the industry works. And it's not much money's being made unless like you have like speaking engagements and all these like things on the periphery. Okay, if I'm a nonfiction author listening to this episode or watching, what are some tips to actually monetize being a nonfiction author?
So the most important thing I could tell any author, nonfiction or not, is that starting off, it's very unlikely your book sales will amount to much. Like they won't amount to a living unless you are just some really amazing podcaster with an amazing platform, or a TikTok star, or an influencer, or a politician, or someone who has the media spotlight, someone who, has millions of people that they can reach directly. So let's assume you are a more average author, and I include myself in that. Book sales are usually minimal compared to what the book can do for you in bringing you other forms of revenue. So that could be consulting, coaching, services to your community. It depends on what nonfiction category you're in, of course, speaking engagements, teaching, even maybe selling products that align with the book. One example I've been using a lot recently, now this is a best-selling author who has a platform, so maybe not the best example, but Dr. Peter Attia came out with his first book, Outlive, which is now a New York Times bestseller, but I can't help but notice that the book is really a great way to lead people to his paid subscription podcast, which of course costs more than the book, and it's a monthly subscription.
Okay.
And it's not cheap. It's like $29 a month or something like that.
Oh,
So for people who are really interested in what he's doing in his work, they're going to end up likely either becoming a subscriber to the podcast for free or eventually paying for the ongoing information and insights that he shares. So often the books are essentially lead generation for something else that you're doing, and that's what brings you the income.
got it. So let's talk about platform building. You're talking about the following, someone would need and whatnot. So, being exposed to the publishing industry, I was always told, okay, email list, There's got to be a
Mhm.
certain number. Social media's got to be a certain number. It takes time to craft a platform. So, Jane, if somebody's working from ground zero, how can they start building that following?
I try to take a very holistic approach here because every person is different and every community is different. So you have to really be in tune with who it is you're trying to reach, what their preferences are, where they go, how they prefer you to communicate with them. And hopefully there's alignment there, of course. So, and when I say holistically, there's so much focus on, let's say, social media followings or those big numbers that get thrown around, like a million TikTok followers, whatever it happens to be, or the size of the email newsletter list. But if you're just starting out, obviously, you're probably not going to have those kinds of numbers. And focusing on those numbers, I think, is the tail wagging the dog. So those numbers are typically a result of something else that you're doing. So this is where I advise people look at the networks you belong to, the relationships you have, the organizations where you play a role. Maybe you're a leader in your community locally, regionally. It's going to, again, it's going to be different for everyone, but it's usually those relationships and networks you belong to that are part of the first steps of growing the platform or seeking partnerships with other people who are in the same space, so that you're not trying to do this in a vacuum all by yourself. That's pretty deadly. So the key here is to look at what's your place in the community, what are the partnerships that you might be able to form to speed your progress and getting visible to that community. And then you kind of have to decide, how are you going to engage to build that platform? And it's usually about producing some sort of value. It might be about producing content. So this is where I would really recommend looking at your strengths. So um, video, audio, written word. Substack is a popular tool today. TikTok is a popular tool. I don't think any of these are better than the other. It's really about your strengths, what you think fits the material or the message that you have, and what you can sustain, because this is not like an overnight thing. It's something where you're going to have to be participating and engaging over, typically years in order to see probably the results that you want, or the results that would matter to a publisher if you're looking for an agent or a traditional deal.
Right. For you, I think I've noticed you use like speaking engagements, consulting as some of those pillars. Is that right?
So I did consulting for many years, but I would say within the last 5 years, most of my focus is on online teaching and education, also the speaking in person and events. And then I also have a paid newsletter. So it's not a Substack, but it would be equivalent to a Substack.
Got it. Got it. So, what are the magic numbers in terms of platforms? Like in the old days, if you had 5,000 Twitter followers, publishers would be
Right.
ecstatic. But are there
Yeah.
set magic numbers anymore?
Some of this depends on the topic, so there's some topics like woodworking, the number requirements are going to be much lower for the, maybe half person out there, like statistically who's watching this, that's going to launch a woodworking book publishing career.
Nice.
Um, but, I would say, like in the category of business, which is highly competitive, or cooking, highly competitive, self-help, highly competitive, you're starting to look at numbers where people get scared off when I mention them, but like six figures all combined is usually what we're looking for as far as the online presence. So your reach ultimately can get into the six figures, even if you don't have six figures on your email list or six figures on TikTok.
Gotcha. So, what are some of the, okay, so say someone's listening, I want to be a nonfiction author, but I don't know my topic. What are more of the popular topics out there? So, self-help, cooking, what were the other ones?
So self-help and business are huge, and self-help encompasses a lot of things. It's relationships, it's self-improvement, it's anything that where you're trying to lead a better life. So that and business and cooking has always been big. Um, Very competitive though, just because there's so much media associated with it, and celebrity chefs, et cetera, et cetera. Not that you don't have celebrities in the other categories. Um, I think those are the biggest.
Right.
I don't normally recommend people just, if they don't already have a presence or some experience to bring to bear, that they would just march right into those categories. You'd have to think very carefully about what your unique angle or perspective is on those areas.
It's usually I write what you know. Is that still good advice or
To some extent, but I
okay?
think especially in nonfiction, I would say, especially when you get into self-help and business, people are looking for things that they haven't already heard in some form. So that might require research.
Right.
Um, it might require, and that might be like survey-driven or poll-driven research. It might be interviews, case studies, but usually you have to bring something to the table other than here's what I experienced or here's what I think. That's where you like, if you want, I always say, if you want to write a book on happiness without having any like qualifications, you better be the Dalai Lama because
Right.
there's just like there are very few people that we want to hear about on some of these really big topics unless they have led lives that are fairly remarkable.
It makes total sense. So Jane, say a nonfiction author wants to, pitch their book to a publisher. I know this is a big conversation. You don't need to get into it really deeply, but by the time they're ready to go to a publisher, what are things that need to be in place for that to happen?
You need a book proposal for nonfiction. The same is not true for novels. I just want to be clear in case there are people with fiction aspirations. But with nonfiction, you've got to have a book proposal, which is essentially a business plan for why the book is going to sell when it hits the market. Now, a lot of authors find this unfair. They're like, well, isn't the publisher supposed to be responsible for selling the book? But, they have a lot of people who are at the door asking, for an advance or asking for that investment in the book. And we're talking about usually a minimum $50,000 investment that the publisher is putting in, if not more, for each book that they publish. So, they have to be able to see some reasonable expectation of a return on that investment. So that's what the proposal is arguing for. And it's a mix of um, so what? Why this book now? Who cares? Who's the target audience for this? It cannot be everyone. And then why you? Why are you the perfect person to write this book? And why does anyone care what you think on the topic?
It's so interesting, Jane. I know when I first started my author journey, I thought you come up with ideas, you just pitch them to the publisher and they'll figure it out if it's commercial or not. I never thought of it. Oh, yeah, you have to make it commercial, but then you realize it's a business. And once you find out from their angle first, okay, their past books, these ones have sold well. There's a history, they're making money. Maybe come up with similar ideas that fill gaps in the marketplace and are commercial. So a lot of authors out there, you're right, they don't think about the publisher first and their interest. So I think it's a major tip. If you're an author out there, figure that out.
Yeah, I think the first exercise I suggest for people who want to get a nonfiction book published is scour your potential competitors or comparable titles. That's a section in the book proposal where you have to talk about the other books that are similar in nature or that might be directly competitive. It's going to depend on the book, because you have to be able to show that there's space for you or how you're in conversation with these other titles.
Got it. Got it. So let's talk about getting a book agent because typically to get a traditional published deal, you need an agent. So
Right.
just very briefly, I know again it's a big conversation you've had with people over the years. Is there any way to just give us the Cole's notes of what that process looks like?
I mean, the good news is getting an agent, the process is really the same as getting a publisher. You prepare the same materials. You're still preparing the book proposal. You're still preparing a query letter, which is basically the one-page version of your proposal. It's a pitch. Sometimes it covers the book proposal document. Sometimes you have to send a query in order for them to even look at the proposal. So I think where most people trip up is in figuring out, okay, which agent should I be querying in the first place? Which agents are appropriate for this book? How, where do you get these names and how do you send your materials in? And there are really only a couple places that you need to know about to research agents. One of them is Publishers Marketplace. This is an industry site, costs maybe $30 a month. It'll allow you to search publishing deals that have been struck by agents and publishers, and you can search by keyword, you can search by category, and find deals that have been made, and you'll see the agent attached. Because if an agent has sold one self-help book, they're likely to sell more. That's the idea. So you go to those agents saying, I know that you sell these sorts of books, and I think you might be interested in mine. There's also a database called Duotrope. It's very inexpensive, maybe $5-10 a month. And it's basically it's a big database of agents and publishers and contests and literary journals. So you can run a search there. There are also, publishers who accept materials without an agent. They tend to be smaller presses, university presses. And so depending on the nature of your work, an agent, they might not see enough money in it for them to represent it, even if it's a good book. So, they're looking for a certain amount of an advance, like $20,000. But there are many publishers out there that are still valuable that don't pay $20,000. They're paying in that 5,000 range. And ultimately, authors typically have to approach those publishers on their own, and they will take unagented work.
Got it. Got it. Is it tougher to get an agent or a traditional publishing deal? What's tougher?
I think it's equally difficult.
Yeah.
But I would say just because you get an agent doesn't mean the book's going to sell. I think people are often surprised to learn that many projects agents represent, in fact, never find a home. So they have a failure rate too.
Got it. And I'll also say, Jane, that for people out there, don't get stuck on always getting an agent to get a book deal. Because I know for me, personal experience, I had a sports book that got signed by Triumph Books in Chicago. And basically it was like a franchise series. So I was getting into that already pre-existing book series, and I did not need an agent. I pitched the publisher or the acquisition editor, and I had the credentials because I worked in sports media, and I was able to get in. So guys, like, you don't always need an agent. If you want a book deal, you don't always need it, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So yeah. So there's that. So okay. So let's talk about, Jane, the future of publishing. We talked about disruption. So you're telling me the publishers are staying alive, that print sales are good. So how long can this continue?
Well, the topic on everyone's mind at the moment, or the challenge, is artificial intelligence, generative AI, which is causing a big problem for nonfiction in particular. I'm just going to focus on nonfiction for this conversation. There are other issues related to fiction and AI. But Amazon in particular has been hit with the flood of AI generated books. You as a customer may not know that they're AI generated. In fact, the New York Times did a big feature. This was been 2 years ago now, about travel books that are AI generated that have hundreds, if not thousands, of reviews that make it look like a good book. It seems like it's legit. They have authors seemingly attached with names like Mark Steves, which people may think, oh, that sounds like an authority, and you're thinking actually of Rick Steves. In any event, they're AI generated, low quality, and there's so much of that AI slop in the marketplace that it causes trouble for the legitimate works. The other issue, and I think it's not quite related to AI, but it could be in the future, is that many people are just going online generally for nonfiction types of information or entertainment. So people will read a Substack newsletter, but they might not buy a book, or they'll watch a YouTube channel, but they won't buy the book, or they'll subscribe to the podcast, but they won't buy the book. So we're getting our information or education or entertainment in other forms. And the book, especially if it's just an informational book, like if there's not a really strong voice attached to it, if there's not a compelling reason for it to be in book form, it's caused the nonfiction side of the market to decline in the last 4 to 5 years. So fiction is up, nonfiction is down. And I think a lot of it is being driven by the fact that we just consume information differently.
And so much more rapidly too. Like if you put out a
Yes,
nonfiction book like a year ago, it's already out of date, like the first
exactly.
month or two, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. That's a huge issue.
Right. So for a nonfiction author to have their book be competitive amongst all this competition for eyeballs, so you're saying they have to have like a really big idea, like and a big voice that really captures people.
Yeah. It really has to merit being a book. And I know that that's very kind of a squishy definition, what merits being in book form. But if it's something that's not going to be relevant in 1 or 2 years, I don't know that I would put it in book form.
That's a good tip. That's a good tip, Jane. Okay, so Jane, you have a book coming out, second edition of The Business of Being a Writer. Do you have any tips or like information, like the business side of publishing? Are there any like bits of information that you could tell us that not all people know about that writing? Is there anything a writer should know but they don't about the business?
I think some people don't realize how little money is in writing and publishing unless you just attain name recognition in your field or in your community. And there's also so much work that has to be done prior to you even approaching a publisher or agent, if that's the path that you want to go down. And we're talking about years often of effort. And there's just, it's, I think people don't quite appreciate how challenging it is to write a good book. It's straightforward to produce a mediocre book.
Right.
But to produce one that will get an agent or that will get a traditional publishing deal that actually pays you meaningful money,
Right.
that is not a quick or straightforward task. And I find that a lot of people don't have the stomach for the revision and the critique and all of that hard work that comes into it. So you have to actually like writing and publishing for this to be worth it. Like you have to have an internal motivation and not be looking for just like this external goal. Like it has to be really important and meaningful to you of its own sake, because this you couldn't help yourself otherwise. It's something you must do.
Great tips. You're serving up the real talk here, Jane. Like, but we need it, Jane. We need
Yes.
it. Awesome. Listen, this has been great, Jane. Where can people find your book and learn more about you?
Best place to go is janefriedman.com. So you'll see all of the things I offer there, including the book.
Fantastic. All right, Jane. Thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you, Dave.
Well, that was a great conversation with Jane. It was really cool getting her insight into the publishing industry and also the realities of trying to make a living as a nonfiction author. It's not easy. So, Jane, I appreciate the honesty. All right, that's it for this interview. Please feel free to subscribe to my YouTube channel and podcast. Until next time, take care and have a good one.